Alright, so today we're going to start at the bottom of page 5, and I know our video looks a little different today, but we'll have to make do with that. And in this section it says to explain how natural selection influences the changes in species over time. Now, what are we talking when we talk about changes in a species over time? Well, that's actually referring to evolution. And our unit on natural selection and evolution does start on Unit 4 of our notes. And again, we are on the bottom of page 5 of our study at the bottom right side. It says to discuss the steps of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So number 1, population of organisms have many genetic variations. Where do these come from? Well, the genetic variations is going to be derived from the DNA. And for the DNA to change, it's initially going to come from mutations. And number 2, organisms could reproduce exponentially, but they don't. Why not? So generally, organisms will try to reproduce as much as possible to ensure that their species survive. But they don't, because only some are going to be able to pass on their genes. Why do they not reproduce exponentially? Because of limiting factors. This could be food, space, water. This could be because it's hard to find a mate. It could be because there's competition between those organisms. So we can say competition as well. And resources. Number 3, genetic variations lead to different adaptations. What are adaptations? Adaptations are actually going to be inherited characteristics that allow for survival. Okay? An adaptation has to be inherited. It has to be from your DNA. If it's something that you learn to do later on, that's not necessarily considered an adaptation. If it's something you pick up later on, again, not necessarily considered an adaptation. It has to be something in your DNA. So these adaptations could be innate behaviors, but it cannot be learned behaviors unless those learned behaviors came from or started from the innate behaviors, such as imprinting. But number 4, some adaptations have better survival value in certain environments. What does this mean? This means at different times, different adaptations allow others to survive better. Okay? If you're a white bunny, well, the white bunny is going to do very well in the snow. But when the snow melts, you're not going to do as well. So maybe the white bunnies survive better and the population of white bunnies increases during the winter time, whereas maybe the brown bunnies do better during the spring and summertime. Number 5, those organisms with adaptations that better fit them to an environment will survive, reproduce, and pass on their genes. What does it mean to be fit to an environment? Well, if you're fit, that means you get to reproduce and pass on genes. Remember, if you don't get to pass on your genes, then in terms of evolution, you're not very important. You didn't get to pass on your genetic information. So whatever traits that you had die with you. So when we want to be fit, we actually get to pass on our genes. And to be fit doesn't mean you're fastest, doesn't mean that you're biggest. It just means that you were able to reproduce and pass on your DNA. Number 6, the next population will have high frequency of genes that have been selected for. Why will the frequency of selected genes increase? So remember that when you're selected for, this means that you survive better in the environment. Now, why does the frequency of those selected for genes increase? Because those were the most fit. Those were the organisms that were the most fit, and so they survive better in the environment. They get to pass on their DNA. Number 7, when this process continues over millions of years, it can lead to speciation. What is speciation? Development of a new species. Okay? Of a new species. Alright, now we're going to go on to the next page. The top of the next page, we actually talk about describing how a population of bacteria can become resistant to an antibiotic. So we're thinking about an insect or a pesticide as well, because the same situation can happen with the insect and pesticides as the bacteria to antibiotics. Just remind ourselves really quick that bacteria are what type of cell? Hopefully you remember that they're prokaryotic cells. And insects are going to be eukaryotic cells. And I want us to look and think about the steps that are listed above. How do this population become more resistant? Well, first thing has to happen. There has to be some differences among the population. And so first there's a mutation for resistance in a few organisms, in a few bacteria. After we have our mutation for resistance, there's going to be some sort of competition and then with the competition, the third thing that's going to happen is that nature will select for resistance. So our competition or our problem or the survival of the fittest right there is going to actually come from the antibiotic. Antibiotics are used to kill bacteria. Antibiotics actually rupture or break the cell wall of bacteria. So if we use the antibiotic on the bacteria, many of them will die because the cell wall is broken. But nature will select for resistance. The one that had the mutation for resistance will go on and survive. Then it will reproduce and pass on genes. And eventually, the population is resistant. This is why it's so bad to continually take a wide range of drugs and prescription pills, because sometimes you're actually doing a little more harm in the long run. Explain why new flu vaccinations must be developed each year. Let's remind ourselves of a couple things right here. That the flu is actually a virus. And the virus, all the virus has is an external shell, some sort of prong that allows it to attach to a host, and DNA inside of it. It's actually not a cell. It's not alive, not considered living. But the flu vaccination must be developed each year because viruses mutate quickly. And so in order for us to be able to fight off those virus infections, we have to make new vaccinations each year. Are vaccinations examples of active or passive immunity? Well, let's remind ourselves of the two. In active immunity, you make antibodies. In passive immunity, you are given antibodies. And just as a reminder, antibodies are white blood cells that fight disease. So what happens is when you get a flu vaccination, you are actually getting an injection of small or broken viruses. And when you get the injection of small or broken viruses, hopefully it's not enough to actually make you sick, but sometimes young children or older adults will get sick from it. But once you get a little bit of the virus in there, hopefully your body's immune system will actually make its own antibodies. So the virus allows you to make your own antibodies. And I didn't do a good job of organizing my paper right here. But why? I would say active, because it triggers immune system to make antibodies. And then if you think about passive immunity, an example of this would actually be breast milk from your mom. Mom will actually give you some antibodies in her breast milk. Next question. Explain the relationship between sickle cell anemia and malaria. Well, let's remember that sickle cell anemia is a codominant genetic disease. So because of a simple mutation, an actual point mutation, caused by a point mutation, in our DNA sequence, you actually have some normal cells and sickle cells. But one benefit is if you are heterozygous NS, normal and sickle cells, heterozygote or heterozygous person will be immune to malaria. And malaria is a disease caused by, or actually that travels by, mosquitoes. It's a very dangerous disease because the disease actually, that protist, the type of cell that causes malaria, will actually hide within your cells, and it's very difficult to treat because it does that. But if you're heterozygous, for some reason having some normal cells and some sickle cells actually gives you an advantage. Next, explain the historical development and changing nature of the classification systems. Explain how the organization of the kingdoms and domains has changed over time. So this is thinking back to Linnaeus and his binomial nomenclature, and Aristotle, who started the first classification systems. But remember, at first, we thought that everything was an animal or a plant. But eventually, we learned that there's not just animals and plants. Later on, we found that there were bacteria and protists and fungi. Bacteria, protists, fungi. And so, what is the current accepted kingdom domain system? Well, we have 3 domains. And the 3 domains are eukarya, archaea, and eubacteria. Okay? Hopefully you remember that archaea means that we have the archaebacteria. The archaebacteria live in extreme environments. Places that are really salty, places that are really hot, places really high or low pH. Our eukarya are actually listed above. That's our animals, our plants, our protists, and our fungi. And our eubacteria are the bacteria that make you sick. Okay, those are the common bacteria that you see. And what is the current 7-level classification system? So 7-level or 7 taxa, remember that? Taxa, and that's represented by that sentence, King Philip came over for green soup. So king, as in kingdom, Philip, as in phylum, came, as in class, over for order, for, which is family, and green, which is genus, and species, which is standing for soup, or soup is standing for species. So King Philip came over for green soup. These are the levels of classification. At kingdom, we are going to be most general, and at species, we're most specific. What is binomial nomenclature? That's going to use the genus plus the species to make our scientific name. So for humans, that would be Homo sapien. Notice how I write it. It is important. Your genus is capitalized, your species is lowercase. If I'm handwriting it, I underline it as well. Next, how are DNA and biochemical analysis, embryology, and morphology used to classify organisms? I do want you to do this on your own. Remember that if this is our last day of the review sheet for you, then you do want to make sure you finish the rest. If you have any questions, please make sure you email me before your exam day, and I'll be able to answer those questions for you. But that's going to be all for today.